Welcome everyone to the third seminar session of the Doing Ecological Economics series. This is a webinar series that is being organized by the International Society for Ecological Economics. And today we will be talking about carbon policies and management with our three guest speakers, Sadhbh Sheeran, Brian Oronoz, and Magnus Merkle. In a minute, I will pass the baton to them so that they can introduce themselves as well and tell us a bit about their work. So as you know, like this seminar series aim to kind of broaden the scope and reach of ecological economics and how people are practicing ecological economics in different sectors and spheres. Thanks to everyone who is there participating and attending today. And just a reminder that you can ask questions throughout the seminar, and you can target specific speakers or just ask in general, and they will reply as they wish. And just kind of finally say thanks to Roldan Muradian, who is managing this in the backstage. So without further ado, let's start with some introduction. So if you can tell us a bit about your work, your experience, and your background in a kind of short, brief commentary, that will be great. And maybe let's start with Sadhbh, who is at the top here.
Thanks, Paula. Hi, everybody. My name is Sadhbh Sheeran, and I'm based in Dublin. I work for Arup, which is traditionally a civil engineering firm, although I sit on the carbon and climate change team. So I kind of work across sustainability projects, from decarbonisation to resilience, kind of through nature and biodiversity right up to kind of circular economy. So it's a pretty broad-ranging stuff. Obviously, today I'm coming with the carbon lens of that. But I've been with Arup for about a year now, and previous to that, I was working for the Irish delegation to the OECD. And thanks for having me, Paula.
Yeah, thank you. Brian?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of today's conversation. Very interesting topics and with such a great company. So pleased to be here, and hello, everyone. Well, my name is Brian. I have over 7 years of experience, more or less, in the fields of carbon pricing, sustainable finance, and banking in general. I have collaborated in different projects alongside public and private stakeholders, international organizations, NGOs, academia, mostly in the global south. I graduated from the University of Edinburgh with a master's in ecological economics a couple of years ago, and I studied before that environmental economics and business administration. I am working on a foundation which is based in Scotland, and I'm working as a carbon markets coordinator there. So happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And last but not least, Magnus.
Yeah, hi everyone. Many thanks. Thanks for having me. My name is Magnus. I have studied ecological economics as a master's some time ago now, and since then I've been working in academia in the widest sense on the socioeconomics of climate change. I've been working in a consortium in the UK, designing spatially explicit scenarios for more kind of detailed climate impact analyses. And currently I'm doing a PhD. I'm based in Norway at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And my project is on the distributional and implementational challenges of carbon pricing, or taxes in particular. So it's kind of a project where the motivation comes from very much public discourse. You know, if we remember the pictures of the Gilets jaunes in France, for example, protesters when energy prices go up. So there are some of these kind of socioeconomic tensions that are motivating my project. There is a lot of theoretical understanding in economics about what the impacts of climate policies, market-based climate policies are, but there's little empirical evidence or very contrasting empirical evidence. So my project is very much, applied on looking at the empirical data that is becoming more and more available now to check, okay, what are the actual impacts of these kind of policies? And I'm very happy to be here today.
Yeah, thanks to the three of you. I should have probably also introduced myself. My name is Paula Novo, and I'm a lecturer in ecological economics at the University leads. And yeah, so I would like kind of to continue asking, and feel free to kind of jump in whenever you want. How is it being an ecological economist in your jobs and in your roles, and how, like, if you kind of brought with you from having studied in ecological economics, how much of that is being applied on your kind of day to day and on your research or your kind of projects?
Do you want me to start, or
Yeah,
anybody?
go
Or
ahead.
so I think I've I mean I've chosen my position the way I have deliberately. I did my kind of master's in ecological economics, but now I am based in a faculty that is mostly applying traditional economic tools. But so I think the kind of the there are, so far I haven't really kind of noticed really massive divisions in terms of how we work and the methods we apply. So I feel like ecological economics gives us a really nice kind of tool set that is maybe a little bit wider than what some other economists get. And so far I feel like it's been quite beneficial actually to have this wider view. But when it comes to climate policy, I think that I'm very interested to hear what the other two are gonna say as well about this. But I feel there might not actually be such a big kind of divergence between ecological economics and the kind of mainstream economics.
Can you maybe elaborate a bit more on that? I think that's
Elaborate on the
or like that you don't see that big divergence between both when it comes to climate policy.
Yeah, I mean, so when we speak about climate policy, I think we very often speak about carbon pricing. That is either taxes on carbon or a permit system. In any case, something that makes polluting carbon kind of more expensive, and that is going to align incentives in a way that means that it's not so not so well possible anymore to emit so much carbon, because you would have to pay for it, basically. So this is a kind of I think this is based on a very kind of traditional economic theory in a way, and it's very much rooted in microeconomics and in markets. I think where ecological economics comes in is maybe to, when you then actually apply your analysis, to remember what is this actually about. It's about a question of natural scale. Basically, we have a carbon budget, and we have some kind of understanding about the global ecosystems and about their stability, and that the stability might be very much impaired if we pass a certain threshold. So at the end of the day, the kind of overall motivation is to remain within a certain scale. Principle one of ecological economics, if we want. And then the economic question is, okay, so how are we going to stay within this boundary? How are we going to allocate the resource that we have? And that is, I believe, an economic question at the end of the day.
Yeah, thanks, Magnus. I don't know, Saith or Brian, if you want to.
I think that's really interesting, actually, Magnus, what you're saying, because I think I kind of relate to it. Like, we work in really different kind of spheres, and I'm in the private sector. And I suppose on a personal level, the work that I do, I bring an ecological economics lens to everything that I work in, because that's my training. And sometimes that fits and sometimes that doesn't fit, depending on the project. And then within projects, there is the possibility, depending on the project, to incorporate, kind of really clearly incorporate, like, ecological economics principles. And when we're looking at kind of whole life carbon assessments, or we were recently working on a project for a bank in Ireland, and they wanted to look at kind of an approach to getting to net zero, and they particularly were interested in a sort of like property portfolio lens on that. And within that project, we were able to kind of apply the approach, but thinking about those kind of core principles of ecological economics, even though maybe in terms of quantities of carbon, what the analysis would have told us was that we need to close bank buildings, or they should reduce the size of their property portfolio, or whatever that was to look like. That wasn't going to be a recommendation that was necessarily appropriate in this instance because of the broader societal impacts. And so like applying that kind of a carbon lens, but one that also has that kind of ecological economics kind of outlook as well, is possible within projects like that. And that's really cool to be able to do, even if that's like maybe not the best example ever. But and then as a company, I think it was the principles of Arup that brought me to Arup, because they match my own values quite clearly. And I don't think Arup as an organization would necessarily identify as being like ecological economics driven, but in reality, actually, there's quite a good kind of match up there in terms of the focus they have on like sustainable scale and just distribution, and thinking about the wider impacts on people and all people. And so that was really interesting for me to go in there and go into that space in a market that is really kind of mainstream economics. And I mean, we're a civil engineering firm traditionally, and we may be a disruptive civil engineering firm in terms of how we're thinking about climate, but civil engineering is a business of carbon, and big carbon at that. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic and trade-off, and I don't necessarily think I completely understand it and completely understand how the principles of ecological economics fit within that, but I can see that they're kind of edging in there, and I think it's a really interesting time to be in the space that I am, because it's cool to have that influence, or it's cool to see the trajectory that it's going on, and how do we actually incorporate this and bring it forward and maybe kind of disrupt that status quo. And I love that Arup are kind of thinking like that, in like committing to doing kind of whole life carbon assessments of all of our building projects, or moving away from working in fossil fuels. And obviously that's kind of the first steps, but it's where is this going to be in 2 years' time or 5 years' time?
Yeah, thanks, Ide. Brian?
Sure. Yeah, kind of in the same line, I think that more than my specific role in the company, it is about the final outcomes and the goals of the collective work that of everyone involved in the company or in Plan Vivo. And yeah, I just want to mention maybe a few objectives to contextualize or to show that I think that the core values or the main objectives of the company are aligned, or I think they are obviously aligned to ecological economics. For example, the restoration and protecting the environments through of the communities that we work with, which are usually small communities, small holders, and maybe like protecting these communities against climate change, and at the same time providing them with a series of co-benefits that directly relate or tackle some of the SDGs, such as poverty relief, gender equality, biodiversity, reduced inequalities, etc. And even more if we take into account all the indirect benefits coming from improved livelihoods, from benefit, something that's called the benefit sharing mechanism. Basically, this is very unique from the standard, which states that 60% of the revenue coming from carbon pricing, in this case, the generation and trading of carbon credits, should go back to the participants, in this case, the communities. So this is actually very much aligned with the ecological economics agenda. Another one is, for example, the capacity building and the free transfer of knowledge among the different stakeholders. And in developing countries, for example, if a project wants to use an approved methodology that we have already there, then they can implement it for free. They don't have to pay for any revisions or anything, as maybe happens in for other standards. So I guess it's not only like the VCM or the voluntary carbon markets and how it is aligned to ecological economics, because that might be like somehow difficult to align, but it's this specific company, the approach that they have, and the mindset of integrating participatory approaches for how methodologies are created and implemented, and a holistic approach of how the revenue is being used, and how, yeah, basically the access to the market that is giving through different mechanisms, like from the way projects are structured, or the finance of, yeah, basically finding ways to help these small projects that otherwise would not have access to this market. And then through this, historically, uh, Plan Vivo has been fulfilling its true purpose, which is basically helping these communities and improving their livelihoods. So yeah, that is something that I very much like. And this is how I see that it's being linked to ecological economics. And that's, I guess, what I can think of for the VCM. But happy, well, in the voluntary carbon market, but happy to discuss more on the, don't know, theoretical potential influence that I see that ecological economics can have on the emission trading schemes or in carbon markets, for example. Sorry, carbon taxes. Although I think those are Magnus' specialities, so I have to leave that to him probably, and happy to do so. But yes, I know that helps to open the conversation on some other topics, maybe.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think yeah, it's actually question one of the kind of following questions I had here as well. Like it's yeah, how to design kind of these kind of mechanisms, drawing on, on ecological economics principles. And I mean, as Magnus already said, like some of these mechanisms, it's not like they are kind of very different, at least in principle, how they work if you are kind of an environmental economist or an ecological economist. But perhaps like ecological economists put attention much more on like, yeah, throughput and equity implications and so on. So I just wanted to ask if you could like, because I know like you're working on these areas, so if you could kind of yeah, give us kind of some insights about what is your thinking around these areas and how these kind of mechanisms can be more ecological economics like.
The question was to me.
Yeah, to you, if you want to take it, and then I think like Brian can also incite. Yeah, but if you want to start, Magnus, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I can really resonate with what has been said about holistic approaches and about kind of, you know, the possibility of disruption that really needs to be taken into account when we model transitions, for example. And this is something that I guess a lot of research is sometimes struggling with. But to get back to how we can kind of consider ecological economics principles in carbon pricing, I think. So if we say that the overall objective is in a way to stay within the planetary boundary, the you know, precise example here is carbon, but it could be you know, applied to another one as well, then that is kind of, you know, that is the kind of main aim of the policy. But then I guess where ecological economics makes a difference is, first of all, to kind of say, okay, the second priority now, or the second question we ask is, what are the equity impacts? And that, I think, in a traditional analysis wouldn't come as a second priority. It would come as a maybe third priority after efficiency considerations. And I think this is a really, really important consideration when, particularly when it comes to political acceptability of climate policies. You know, you could kind of, you can put people very quickly off, I think, if it becomes very obvious that a policy is going to lead to disadvantages for low-income households right away, or for rural households, for example. So I think there an implementation of a policy that kind of makes sure that there is, you know, actors in a country, for example, are heterogeneous. There is a difference between people who live in urban areas and who live in rural areas. There is a difference between different income quintiles of people, and you know, the impact of a carbon policy, for example, needs to be modeled probably differently for these kind of different groups. Reactiveness of people to you know, a carbon price, for example, is going to vary a lot, and is going to have a massive impact on what the effect of the carbon pricing policy, for example, is going to be. So yeah, I think these are some examples where kind of ecological economics really helps to get this kind of real world applicability in a way of the policy right. The other thing I wanted to say is about structural change. This is my kind of topic that I'm focusing on at the moment, and that I'm very excited about. And that is also related to, climate policy in the widest sense. I think the question is not only how can we kind of decarbonize every sector according to the current economic setup we have, but how does the layout, the sectoral setup of the economy change? How can it change? And I think it's not only about consuming less, for example, but it's also consuming other things. If we just consume the less of the same things, that's maybe going to push forward our budget by a few years, but it's not going to get us to a net zero society. So these are some of the questions I think that are really interesting in this kind of climate policy discourse. How can we kind of push for such a structural change as well? And traditionally, I think economics is not necessarily very strong in this understanding of these disruptions, as you say it, because they are absolutely not following any equilibrium logic, for example.
Magnus, I think that's so interesting, and I agree with everything that you hear you saying there. I'm just like, how do we actually do it? How do you get that like distribution right when you apply it into a country? And even in the last few weeks, it's been kind of all over the Irish news around they've just increased our carbon taxes, and there's huge pushback, and like the price of carbon is nowhere near the real price of carbon even still. And how do we, is it about like pricing it differently, or is it about returning the money taken in from that pricing and distributing it differently? Like how do we do this? And it's really not my area of expertise, so it's like I just find it so interesting, and I know this is where you work.
Yeah, I would like to pick up one of the questions from the audience, because I think it kind of fits very well with what Said is raising here. So it's a question from Fanny Ramos Quispe, and it's asking, can you develop more about how do you deal with social and historical injustices through markets? Brian, would you be happy to kind of try to address this also from your own work and from the work that you do at Plan Vivo and how you deal with these issues?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think specifically markets are not designed to address historical, in this case, injustice, right? But what we can do is to try to use some of the mechanisms, in this case from carbon finance, to actually heal some of these of these injustices or the consequences of this historical injustice. Whether it's on the social part or maybe the environmental part. And for example, there is like a huge debate on the environmental and social safeguards of the projects that we currently are developing or that are to be developed and being part of the carbon markets. So I guess making sure that we have a bare minimum standard for all the projects that are being that are in the pipeline, for example, or that are being developed or issuing credits, etc. And then the use of that revenue going back to those communities to basically for being used as they want to and giving them the freedom. This is kind of a way in which these historical injustices are being addressed. It's not that we can go backwards on things that actually happen, but we can amend our mistakes, quote unquote, and doing things right from this point onwards. So this is kind of how markets can do it. And maybe, again, this is being addressed or can be addressed through this holistic approach. And the idea, and it kind of links a bit on how ecological economics concepts and approaches can be included in these mechanisms. I guess this is kind of the idea of how can how can we increase the reach of ecological economics into these kind of mechanisms? First, I guess we have to assess which concepts and approaches can be introduced and how can influence the different policies, mechanisms, or even good practices or standards in the market for our respective sectors, and then trying to use the appropriate channels to influence such policies, legislation, even or smaller things such as good practices for one sector in specific or one market in this case, and then incorporating those approaches and trying that this is a standard for the whole market and not just in this case one standard for but for all standards. And in this way we are scaling up the good practices and the approaches and ecological economics in general. I know this is easier said than done, but I think this is like kind of the most straightforward way to go. So I hope I had partially answered the question with my the first part of my intervention.
Yeah, thank you. Said and Magnus, do you want to also add something to, I think, this kind of important question that kind of relates a lot to kind of environmental justice issues?
Yeah, I think I totally agree that markets are not designed to reduce inequalities or historical injustice. So that's, yeah, I don't think we can kind of take that as a sort of solution to it. But I think when designing, for example, a carbon pricing regime, then it's very relevant what we do with the revenues and how these get exactly redistributed, and then the idea of giving it, straight back to households is just one option amongst a lot of different options. Healthcare could be free, for example, in return to higher carbon prices. Food prices could be lower if taxes on them were lowered. So I think there are some kind of ways how to make carbon pricing less regressive and therefore more acceptable. Because I think at the end of the day, very often it depends on if everybody gets affected the same way by something, then it kind of is more acceptable than if some people are really losing out. And I mean, there is the example of somebody who's able to live inside a big city and is able to pay for a big car in that city is probably going to be able to afford double prices of fuel. But somebody who lives just in the outskirts of a city, who has to use the car to travel into it and doesn't necessarily have the means to just buy a new electric car, which costs a lot, is going to be hard hit by a policy that doesn't kind of consider these different impacts for different people. I think another really big issue is all this kind of the exemptions that we find in historically, or at least throughout the last 10 or 20 years of environmental policy, that sectors that would have to change a lot get systematically exempted from carbon pricing, at least from the kind of price that we would need in order to see the change that we need to see. And we therefore kind of don't even allow for the structural change that is probably necessary on the basis of competitiveness concerns, like as if we want to be competitive with something that has no future. To me, that doesn't really make a lot of, at least from a strategic point of view, it doesn't make much sense for me. And yeah, I don't know, Saif, what was your opinion on the question?
Yeah, no, I really agree with you. I think that whole thing of like building on a foundation that is already not stable, it makes it really challenging to choose. I mean, you just can't choose the best path if you're starting off with policies that are in place that are fundamentally not going to work in the long run. And to me at least, we're in a difficult situation because there's a piece around kind of resolving those policies. So the existing policies that are there that will need to change. So things like, I don't know, fossil fuel subsidies or any of those things. And then there's the piece around what's coming in now that we do need around kind of the carbon pricing and how we do that. And the conversations, obviously there's a huge kind of overlap there, but they're also separate conversations that need to be had and different things need to be done there. And I think a lot of it for me is about how we communicate this, because like both what Brian was saying first and then what Magnus you were saying afterwards, like to me that makes total sense. It's really clear and sort of obvious, and it just kind of brings me back to things like, why isn't this happening and why is this not as clear to decision makers? And obviously there's a huge kind of, there's no one answer to that, and it's a really kind of complex historical, economic, like social situation that has brought us to the place that we are now. But for me, I think if we were having, or if people were having more transparent conversations at all levels, from like the highest levels of decision making right down to the kind of community level around these things, and if that education piece was going on, that we would see a lot more rapid change, and it would, those conversations would begin to create that change towards kind of more justice considerations, towards policies that were more transparent, more functioning, delivering the outcomes that are desired. And maybe that's a really simplistic view on my part, but what we're doing at the moment ain't working. So maybe that might.
Yeah, I think like this resonates a bit with just seeing a bit Bisema comment, no, that she had similar problems in the sense trying to like assess the equity implications and the distributional implications of a carbon tax, carbon energy tax in Ireland, and that was not kind of funded. So unfortunately, the tax was implemented without the revenue recycling options being properly assessed. That was Bisema's experience. I just wanted to remind the audience that feel free to kind of ask questions throughout. I will be picking them up from here as they come. So now we have Kaylee Murphy saying that working in US politics right now, I found that doing a model that works on a micro level has been making national conversation they cannot ignore. Okay, that's kind of very good. What is I think that's probably in line with maybe what Magnus you're trying to do as well for your PhD, you know, like trying to kind of come to that level of analysis that perhaps cannot be ignored anymore in terms of how like the different kind of carbon taxes impact different sectors of the population, and what are the implications for that in terms of distributional impacts. I wanted to go back to something that Brian mentioned earlier about, so there is clearly an issue here. How can these mechanisms be designed with a much more kind of focus on like distributional issues mainly and equity? So Brian, if you kind of go back to that, I think you mentioned that like, I don't know, 3 comments earlier. So if we can go back to that and if you can tell us more about these ideas that I think you've been developing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I based my comment bit on the research that I made for my dissertation, for example, which was actually in carbon pricing, ecological economics for carbon pricing, and I tried to focus mainly on using a system dynamics methodology, trying to model causal loop diagrams on ETSs and carbon taxes to find systems feedback loops and archetypes, and then finding sensitive intervention points where ecological economics principles and approaches could be used to break those archetypes, improve the system overall. And I think that the main idea was to provide a framework, using those diagrams maybe, that could be used for future research, and I mean, hopefully not only research, but in this case, to serve as inputs for these initiatives and policies that can incorporate ecological economics into the mechanisms that we're talking about right now. So I think that, as I mentioned, we have to identify which are these mechanisms or policies or standards that we can influence through research, and then like finding these sensitive intervention points where like ecological economics principles are compatible, and in the end they will improve the system so it can have more political acceptability and even be financially feasible, and then that can bring make the whole change attractive for people who are maybe not familiar with ecological economics or who don't actually care about whether implementing this or not. But you're like making uh, a dual I don't know benefit here, because on the one hand you're improving the system and also incorporating ecological economics, which will bring a different set of co-benefits. And for example, some of the ones that I remember is again the use of revenue, making sure that the carbon pricing instrument, whichever it is, I know, for example, can have or can signify a universal minimum income on unemployment insurances, or even reinvesting this climate finance into instruments to reduce, like for mitigation instruments or adaptation instruments. Another one is, uh, it sounds more theoretical, of course. It's switching this from hedonistic consumption based well-being to eudaimonic approaches, and in practical terms that kind of signifies reducing emissions from unnecessary consumption, but through, for example, the concept of energy services, which link obviously to emission reductions through energy efficiency, and that links again to how these measures are being implemented for sectors that are under the ETS or carbon taxes, depending on the jurisdiction, etc. So basically understanding how the system works will let you uh, identify this systemic points or systemic archetypes, structures where you can intervene, and then yeah, basically break those paradigms and break those uh, things with actually instruments that are being there, like having there for a long time, and we know how to tackle those things with different instruments. We just don't want to apply those to carbon pricing, and it's there to be done. I think, personally think, again, easier said than done. But yes, happy to like to hear others opinion on this.
Yeah, Magnus or Seth, you want to follow up on this? Or
I maybe have a question for Brian on that.
good?
Yeah, sorry, Brian. I really hope it's an easy one for you to answer, as opposed to me throwing in some kind of curveball now. Yeah, how do you, when you're thinking about the carbon pricing and you're thinking about what shape that will take, I think having the framework to kind of help you find those sort of points of change is so important. But how do you make sure that it is the real system that you're looking at, or as close to the real system as you're going to get? And how do you make the decisions around kind of the breadth and the depth of the equity concerns? And how do you ensure that when you change that system, while you might be kind of alleviating one problem, you're not fueling one that you haven't even built into your model?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, the big question, because in the end, I think that the system dynamics actually, that's the uh, one of the things that it addresses, that maybe you're thinking of doing a good here, but then you have unexpected consequences somewhere else, and that's actually another archetype. But I guess, well, you can model it, and you can operationalize it, and then in the end you hope that what you're doing is okay. Obviously you'll be focusing on specific parts of the mechanism, for example the use of offsets within the ETS or the use of revenue within the ETS, and then you can kind of limit the the, the possible, I mean, in a way, that system is already working, so you can have proxies of how certain policies that are being implemented right now or that have been implemented in the past where have those affected, like based on case studies or something, and then that's kind of a proxy of what the impact of your new policy or your policy intervention will have on things, and in a way you can kind of module the impact that you want to have. Although, yeah, it's not very simple, I would say. Most of the times, what I've seen from the literature is that uh, system dynamics has been used to model very specific parts of ETSs, specifically in China, for example, and specifically in revenue. So I guess it's way more complicated than I might foresee. But yeah, in the end, I think we have to look at the larger picture. And for example, another thing that I remember, probably if I'm jumping into another thing, but based on the framework that's being proposed by ecological economics, um, more recent ecological economists, maybe, it can be argued that carbon taxes and specifically cap and trade systems or schemes contain the main elements of a state economy, uh, based on micro freedom and macro stability. And I remember that based on one of the comments here. So I think it's uh, evident that we have in our hands, in this case with these instruments, something that can really relate to ecological economics, and for example in this micro freedom that the system has, like how emission allowances are distributed and used and allocated, and that is left completely to the market in the neoclassical sense, for example. But then the macro stability comes when, well, the cap, for example, or the limit of emissions or something else is based on biological rates or in targets that are backed up by science, and that are aligned with planetary boundaries, for example, that Magnus was talking about earlier. So yes, I think there is always a way in which we can work within this safe, macro, stable state, and then allow the market to do their things, to allocate efficiently and etc. And I think that can be done in like a macro scale for the ETS, and also for smaller components of the mechanisms. So I guess that's also a way in which theoretically I would like approach your question of how to limit the impacts and not to make sure that ended up worse, you know. But yeah, sorry if I took too much time.
No, that's yeah, and yeah, it seems like a bit yeah, Visma also agrees with this, no, from her comment on yeah, that integral modeling kind of should account to for all important aspects for ecological and social sustainability. So precisely to avoid like those kind of yeah, trade-offs, or like I mean not trade-offs, because I think the trade-offs are unavoidable. I mean, there will always be some form of trade-offs, but at least for unintended consequences of what we are kind of trying to solve, and then come up with a worse problem somewhere else, by not taking into account that kind of integrated perspective, or a more integrated perspective at least. Yeah, I don't know if yeah, the audience, if there's more comments or questions, please feel free to kind of put them. We are now entering kind of the last few, like 15 minutes or so of the seminar. So there are like still some opportunities to ask questions to our speakers today. I don't know if, yeah, Magnus or Sa, you wanted to kind of follow up on any of these about like how to, yeah, look at carbon pricing in a much more holistic way, or at least kind of to take into account like the system and how like different pricing mechanisms can have this, yeah, like can be looked at when taking into account like these different perspectives, and whether that's kind of currently done, or how it's done, or mostly not done. And also I guess that might be more for Magnus from kind of your research work, but then also for Sai, on your practical work, which is much more around like very concrete projects. How do you integrate these potentially multiple objectives and like tensions as well, and how do you deal with that, with those? So I don't know, Magnus, if you want to start, and then we go to Sai.
Sure, I can, and I wanted to maybe start from Visema Viv's comment about that she was told that, you know, when suggesting a more disaggregated view, that this wasn't kind of environmental economics. I mean, that is the most unconvincing argument against a research methodology that you can imagine. Like, why is that relevant? I think that the standard should be: is the research rigorous? Is it based on facts? You know, can you make transparent arguments for the fact that it is important? And then it should be done irrespective of whether something complies with some kind of school of thought or some kind of orthodoxy or not. But maybe to say something more about how carbon pricing could be implemented to really kind of consider the scale thing as well as the justice thing. There was one more point that I felt was maybe interesting to the group, and that is the idea of an endogenous carbon tax. So when you know, very often when we talk about carbon pricing, we kind of speak of the two main systems. One is the permits, tradable permits, and the other one is the tax. And the advantage with the permits is that we have a very fixed kind of allocated budget of how much can be emitted, and then there's going to just be those possibilities are going to be traded around. And then with the tax, we actually don't have this certainty of, you know, how much the reaction is going to be, how much reduction of emissions we are going to have, because we don't know how people are going to react to the carbon price. But a disadvantage with permits is that you find in the literature is that it somehow is kind of less easy to distribute the revenues here, particularly if we use, you know, grandfathering, where the revenue is very unclear. So the clear advantage to say that with the tax is that we gain revenues that then can be redistributed to offset some of the adverse socioeconomic effects. And then one possibility could be to just set the level of the tax endogenously as to, you know, whether we are on track in terms of meeting the Paris targets or not. If the emissions are higher than the actual trajectory, then the tax has to be increased. If they are lower, then the tax has to be lowered. But one open problem that I would still see with this is that once we actually manage to reduce emissions to a level where, you know, people don't end up spending much on this carbon tax anymore, there is obviously less revenue being taken in that can be redistributed. So then we kind of end up at this, you know, same initial point of possibly an inequality issue. I'm not sure whether this is sometimes kind of found in the kind of public discourse as well, or whether it's kind of too niche academic stuff. But I would be really interested in what Sadhbh and Brian think about this kind of idea of an endogenous tax, and also the problem that once we reach the point, we don't get any revenues anymore. There's nothing to redistribute anymore.
I might come in on Paula's first question around like how we do this or how we deal with this in projects. And I'm probably going to lean on the kind of carbon management side of this as opposed to the carbon pricing, just because I think it's slightly easier or slightly clearer to talk about, for me at least. So I think on that side, it's not simple. It's never simple. And there are kind of a couple of rules which just need to be kind of followed. And the first one of those is to absolutely base everything that we do within the best and latest science that's available. And, you know, I imagine that that's kind of applicable to the entirety of our conversation today. And we base things in fact, and it's not always simple what we're presenting to clients. Sometimes there may be kind of, as I think it was Magnus, maybe it was Brian was talking about, there may be different schools of thoughts coming in, but as long as we lay those out clearly and we lay out the different arguments that are there, it allows clients to kind of make the right decision for them with as much available information as we can. Like, the information is never going to be perfect. And, you know, we deliver whatever the deliverable of the project is. But perhaps the really important bit is the bit that comes before the deliverable. It's all the conversations and all the meetings with the client and the explanations around the different ways of dealing with their carbon emissions, or the different outcomes of making decisions along the way at whatever stage of their business or their project or whatever it is that we're dealing with. And it's really interesting, the solutions that come from that. And I think the decisions are sometimes quite difficult. So even thinking about kind of projects that I've been working on recently, we work with a kind of transport organization in Ireland. They build transport infrastructure and provide transport services across the island. And obviously, the nature of that world is that it's really carbon intensive, or at least traditionally has been. And like there are very interesting conversations there about, do we build more roads, or what does that look like going forward, and how do we manage carbon within kind of planetary boundaries, while also ensuring that all people on the island are provided with sufficient kind of transport infrastructure and services. And I don't think there's a simple answer to that question, and I think it's nearly kind of case by case and road by road, or infrastructure service by infrastructure service, of how that looks and how that evolves. And maybe it's a question of it evolving from building to maintaining. But it's kind of it's a challenging one, and I don't think there's a perfect answer to it. And I think in the case of how we work, we bring the science and we bring the fact to every project, but the approach may change slightly depending on the client and depending on the project and the needs that kind of underlie that. And I don't know, maybe Magnus or Brian, you'd be better able to speak to if that's like, if those kind of considerations come into like designing for kind of models for carbon pricing and taxing as well, or if that's a very different thing and that just relates more to the kind of management of carbon side.
I'm gonna step in just to, because we are heading into the last kind of 7 minutes of our seminar. And there's like a question that I think can be quite good to wrap up from the audience. So Daniel is asking, like, often economics focuses on price-based approaches, but can policy mixes, so where carbon taxes and rules and possibly other mechanisms help in the real world? And I think it's kind of ties quite well with, I think, like what Sadhbh was also talking about, like this kind of case by case and the use of potentially different things that complement each other. So if you can kind of make a very short final statement around this question about how to kind of move beyond looking just at carbon taxes, but like at the policy mix, that will be great. And I think that will bring us to the end of this seminar. So Brian, do you want to start? Final kind of.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be very brief because I also wanted to take again the question from Magnus on what happens when there is no longer revenue to redistribute, like in society. And I think that theoretically carbon taxes or environmental taxes in general are meant to tend to be zero, because that means that there is no longer the need for the tax itself. And that means that society is not being harmed by whatever was causing the damage, and that it doesn't need to be compensated anymore. Although that's kind of unrealistic in a way. Another one is that through, I guess, very in line with what Daniel was saying here, we shouldn't be thinking of carbon pricing as a standalone mechanism or a series of instruments. It has to be embedded within a larger policy mix, public policy mix, which in turn can be linked to renewable energy certificates, for example, which are also market-based, but also with regulatory like legislation that doesn't involve a market approach that should be implemented whether you want it or not, and that probably goes more on other environmental damages such as biodiversity, for example. But in the end, that links to other planetary boundaries that are also have the same level of importance, one could argue. So in a nutshell, yes, these kind of policy mixes can actually have an impact on the real world. And it depends on how you structure, again, or what are the goals of these policy instruments, or whether those are based on market or not. What is the final goal of them? For example, the price in the carbon tax can be linked to the social cost of carbon, and that assures you that you have like even this historical fairness and justice linked to the price that's being used within a market instrument. That's just one example, but yes, it can be linked to ecological economics and have a real impact, and then using a market-based instrument. And yeah, just to round up, I think that the main takeaway would be that it's probably stating the obvious anyways. It's not going to be easy, but it has to be worth it. It has to be worth it, especially for those of us who believe that the incorporation of ecological economics into the public policy agenda is key for prevent, or maybe more realistically to limit the negative impacts of social ecological crisis. It's worth trying, and it's worth making it real.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Magnus, you want to add like a very quick wrap up, take home message, but really quick.
There's so much theoretically that one could say, I think, but yeah, it was really nice to hear what to see all the questions and comments, and to hear all the different opinions, and to discuss with you guys. I think we have to be a bit open about these different kinds of goals that we want to achieve, and allow for more indicators in analysis. If we only always look at output, GDP, for example, then that limits also the kind of type of goal that we can set. I think that is one takeaway for me, and it kind of links to the idea of multidimensionality of this whole problem. It's not only climate, but it's also, there are cultural dimensions, there are biodiversity issues, there is land use, and in a kind of meaningful analysis, this needs to be included. And I think ecological economics equips us really well with this kind of wider scope, and the idea that there is not one size fits all solution, which again relates to Daniel's point as well. I'll
Thank
give the
you.
last 2 minutes for Sadhbh.
Yeah, Sadhbh.
Yeah,
Very
I
quickly.
mean, I agree with all of that, and I think there's a diversity of goals, and that requires a diversity of policy solutions, and that's what ecological economics really promotes. And I think, we've been talking about aspects of carbon pricing and carbon taxes and things today, and it's just really important to reiterate that they may be part of the solution, but they're not the whole solution. And it's just really important to remember that going forward. So yeah, that's everything. That was short.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm sorry for pushing you these last kind of few minutes. Thanks everyone in the audience for your questions and comments. And if you are not a member of the International Society for Ecological Economics, I strongly encourage you to become one. And also, if you have any ideas or you would like to participate in one of these webinars as speakers, please feel free to reach out. And finally, thanks to Roland Muradian for keeping us on track on the backstage. Thanks everyone, and hope to see you soon. Bye.